Hey everyone, Nathan here, president of Saybrook University. Welcome to another episode of Saybrook Insights. Today, my guest, Dr. Drake Spaeth, specialization coordinator of our existential humanistic specialization, that's a mouthful, here at the university, joins me in a conversation in which we talk about, yes, psychology, but also teaching. Believe it or not, many moons ago, I too taught in the college classroom, and I loved every minute of it. The opportunity to work alongside undergraduates learning about a certain set of sociological concepts for the first time, or doctoral students piecing together how to do a research study was both life affirming and invigorating for all involved, I think, and I hope. Students lie at the heart of what higher education is all about, and I believe that one of the core reasons our sector has lost some of its way is because we forgot that students are at the core of why we do what we do. Yes, the faculty are important. In fact, they're an essential ingredient because without them, our students lack the mentorship, the guidance, and instruction so necessary. Yet for too long in higher education, the classroom for many faculty was seen as a hurdle, an obstacle to getting that degree rather as a vehicle, and for many of our faculty seen as a research lab as opposed to a teaching opportunity and a research lab. For many of us on the receiving side, there were plenty of teachers out there who struggled with pedagogy. How to teach is an important aspect in what we do day in and day out. Yet, we don't teach how to teach at the university level oftentimes. Our faculty are incredibly smart, wickedly so, in a good way. But losing in translation the content or ideas that could be transformational is a huge miss. And I'm reminded about a time near the end of my own undergraduate when a faculty member named Joseph Baber, he was teaching music history as a course, and he's a great example of someone who didn't lose that teaching pedagogy in translation. He was discussing that transition from the Romantic to the Impressionistic and modern era in music and the arts in general. Dimming the lights, playing three different pieces, one from the middle Romantic period, one from the late Romantic, and then Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun by Claude Debussy. He narrated the arc of this transition in what felt like real time, highlighting the change in such a way that to this day I have never forgotten. And why is this important? I could have read about it, but there's something about having that guide, that teacher who cares so deeply about what it is that's important that can then be applied to one's own professional and personal life. And that it did. Enter in Drake Spaeth again, that finest of Saybrokians, one of. He's a lion in the classroom, an academic who sees himself in journey with students in their search for meaning, of finding their own way into the psychological profession. He brings rigor and humor to the classroom, dedication and joy to all that he does, whether it's the classroom, the committee room, or just shooting the breeze. And I really resonated with him as he talked about his teaching and my own passion and joy for teaching that I just talked about. My hope today is to dive in with Drake about his approach, especially in the online world, how he brings complex topics like existential humanistic psychology to life, and how he works with students in their journey. Of course, we'll try to hit the big highlights around Saybrook and humanistic psychology, given leadership in these areas at the university and national level where psychology is concerned. All right, let's get to this interview with Dr. Drake Spaeth. Dr. Drake Spaeth, you are now my third existential humanistic psychologist interviewee in less than a week. Something tells me that this is a trend, and I'm not sure. No, I'm teasing. I think it's a great trend, and it's very exciting to have you here today on Saybrook Insights. So before we get started, what I ask every interviewee, tell us about yourself and how you found and wound your way to the great Saybrook University.
Okay, well, I hope you can bear just a little bit of a tale because it does actually start when I was about 11 years old. So if you'll bear with me, I was an avid reader, and my parents tried to indulge that as best they could on limited budget and all of that. But I so looked forward to going to the bookstores and one in particular close to us was a tiny little kind of hole in the wall bookstore called Bookland, which, to an 11-year-old kid, a place called Bookland just sounded like a paradise of sorts, at least one as geeky as I was. So I spent a lot of time in the fantasy and science fiction section trying to decide carefully what my meager allowance would allow me to get. And in kind of going up and down that section, a book fell off the top shelf like Isaac Newton's apple and literally hit me on the top of my head. And it was a book called The Portable Jung by edited by Joseph Campbell.
Oh my
Yeah.
God.
And I had no idea at 11 years old who either of those gentlemen were, but I knew enough that if a book kind of bonks you on the head, no matter what your other agenda is, I had the good sense to sort of pick it up and take a look at it. So I made my way to the dim corner of the bookstore, and what I took in, I understood maybe a third of what I was reading randomly, but it was enough to catch my 11-year-old brain on fire. So my first introduction to psychology was Carl Jung through the lens of Joseph Campbell, and I understood just a little bit, but I got enough of it. And then, of course, the rest of my academic journey was finding out that no one really kind of did Jungian therapy, at least in the mainstream worlds that I was going to come in contact with. And I had to pursue those interests kind of on the side. But it was a toss up about whether I would become an English major or a psychology major. And I ended up ultimately in college majoring in psychology and philosophy with a theology minor. And so that's that combination of philosophy, psychology, spirituality. It just had such a powerful formative impact on me. And I ultimately had that at Xavier University in Cincinnati, a Jesuit institution. They taught me to think critically. They valued an open-minded quest for learning. They valued service to the world. I can't say enough about the quality of the Jesuit education and the social consciousness that it fostered. And I went from there briefly to Emory University, which ended up being a horrible disaster. It was an emphasis on like strict reductionistic medical model psychology. And I had no idea what I was getting myself into, and it was not a good match. They were not happy with me. I was not happy with them. So I ended up transferring to the Chicago School of Professional Psychology because at that point I figured I really wanted to roll up my sleeves and do the work in the world rather than be an academic. So instead of graduating with a PhD, I ultimately graduated with a Psy.D from the Chicago School back in the days when it took up half a hallway of the old Dearborn train station in downtown Chicago.
Oh my gosh, way in the old days,
And
eh? Yeah.
the second floor. And I mean, my classes were 6 students apiece, and we had 3-hour conversations with professors that served as classes. And we had an APA accreditation that still felt a little squeaky new, but I had a much more fulfilling time at that school and was introduced to a lot more of a well-rounded theoretical approach. And existential humanistic came into the focus, but only just barely. So I did some readings in that, and I found that it had some interesting correspondences and differences from the depth psychology that I was used to, and ended up really falling in love with it, and kind of then self-taught of my way through existential humanistic approaches. Then ultimately, found my way after spending quite a few years. I did a internship in the Air Force, and I was an active duty Air Force psychologist for 4 years, and spent some time at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and Lackland Air Force Base. And from there, worked in many diverse settings. I worked for private practices, hospitals, mental health centers, university counseling centers, and spent 3 years as a therapist at a residential facility for emotionally disturbed adolescents, was clinical director for a few months, ultimately left there feeling a little burned out and decided to try my hand at teaching, and ended up getting a gig at Elmhurst College. And shortly after, the Chicago School decided to give me a turn as an adjunct professor in the forensic department. And later the clinical Psy.D program. And I ended up loving teaching so much after rejecting the academic path initially in my career that I ultimately flip-flopped and did the clinical piece on the side after, as I said, quite a few years of rounded clinical work. And I decided to plunge fully into becoming an academician and a professor. So I ended up getting more coursework.
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt, Drake. How long ago was that actually when you started teaching?
So I had my first adjunct gig at Elmhurst College, and now it's Elmhurst University, back in 2004. And by 2006, after teaching for a couple years adjunct at the school, at the Chicago School and Elmhurst, I taught in the forensic program. I taught in the clinical Psy.D program, standard classes like lifespan psychology, abnormal psychology, psychopathology, those kinds of things. And they gave me social bases of behavior class, cognitive affective bases, bio bases. And I did a lot of immersion to try to refresh my knowledge of all of those things and got some great, well-rounded experience in teaching. So I was fortunate then to have landed a department position in the counseling department at the Chicago School in 2006. So really, between then and now, I've taught both as department faculty and adjunct in various iterations of the counseling department at the Chicago School. Also returned to the forensic program online, taught in the international psychology PhD program there as an adjunct. They've been so good to me as an alum and, certainly as a student while I was there, just as an adjunct faculty and department faculty. I managed somewhere along the lines to pick up a Distinguished Alum Award for the Chicago School, which thrilled me to no end. And the road to Saybrook opened up through Lewis Hoffman, who I met at a conference after just fanboying all over him about using his existential psychology East and West books in my humanistic psych classes at the Chicago School. And ultimately, after cultivating kind of a friendship with him, I heard a rumor that Saybrook was coming into the Chicago school education system, and I fell off my chair. I figured it was destiny opening up and all of that. And I think it was sort of just before that, if I'm not mistaken, that in 2015, I just wanted to be connected to Saybrook in some way. So the later developments of it coming into TCS Ed, I just felt like it was destiny calling. And I remember saying to Lewis, I just need to be connected to Saybrook for history's sake. I want my name with that school. What do you have? And he said, nothing. In fact, there's quite a few people in line to teach. And I'm like, okay. And then he called me like the next day. How do you feel about Alan Watts? And I said, oh, I only went through this intense obsession with him all through college. Why? And he said, you're hired. We need someone to teach the life and work of Alan Watts. I'm like, you're kidding. And he said, yeah, and I think it's the only course on him that we have in the world. And I'm like, you're kidding. So the rest, as they say, is history. I developed my connection to Saybrook, and ultimately when some other opportunities that I was supposed to have with the Chicago School that took me here to Wisconsin kind of fell through, I joined, the online program at the Chicago School for counseling, and then a position to apply for the psychology department chair position opened up in 2018. I applied for and secured that, and for nearly 3 years held that position before taking on the existential humanistic psychology specialization coordinator position that I currently hold.
Your journey is really quite amazing. I loved hearing kind of like Isaac Newton and the apple. Just for our audience, so when Drake mentioned the Chicago School actually was the founding member of TCS education system, the Community Solution Education System. And Saybrook joined in 2014 as a separate entity under that umbrella. And so that is kind of how we all linked arms. But, we have our separate institutions that represent different pathways, whether it's psychology or education or law. And so it's been our pleasure and honor to have Drake be able to serve both institutions in this capacity. So really, really great that we were able to land you here at Saybrook. And I do have one question as a follow up to your interest and passion around existential humanistic psychology, especially around therapeutic interventions. So, and I asked this of Ed Mendelowitz. I think you're probably familiar with Dr. Mendelowitz too. There's controversy in some camps about existential psychology, about whether it's, maybe not the legitimacy of it, but is it a viable technique? And I thought maybe you could speak a little bit to that in terms of its use as a therapeutic intervention among many. What does that look like in practice, especially from someone who is a practitioner as well as a scholar?
You're putting me in mind of an interview I saw that I sometimes use for classes with Gordon Wheeler, who is a Gestalt therapist. And the interviewer asked him, how he ultimately came to be a Gestalt therapist. And his response to that would be really similar to my own, which is that when we're all graduate students in clinical psychology, learning psychotherapy, and we're learning about the various psychotherapeutic approaches, we tend to see ourselves reflected to varying degrees in each of the theoretical paradigms. And ultimately, of course, many of us who do clinical work end up working integratively. And I am, no exception to that. I certainly do that. But existential humanistic psychology and psychotherapy is the foundation of my integrative work because it's the approach that I most see myself reflected in. So when we think about working with clients and doing psychotherapy, it's the approach that most reflects what I think therapy needs to be about and for more than the other approaches. And I am a therapist who is not particularly attached to working with insurance companies. So I end up taking very low fees for my work because Saybrook, the Chicago School, and other academic institutions pay my bills nicely. And, any consultation work that I do, any workshops that I give, I can keep my therapy rates really low. This allows me to work with the freedom without insurance companies breathing over my shoulder, trying to micromanage what I do. So any judgment I might get about how long I work with a client or the so-called rigid reductive measures of empirical efficacy, which I challenge and counter with what is the nature of evidence itself at the end of the day, and what about practice-based evidence? I think there's a lot of practice-based evidence in doing existential humanistic psychotherapy work with clients because it gets at the core questions that trouble most of us. And ultimately, like if you even work with anxiety, all surface anxiety has at its source this primal kind of anxiety. And we can debate about the extent to which death anxiety is common across cultures or not. But certainly for Western clients, this anxiety about this limited time, as Rollo May says, that we have, and the motivation that that gives us to create and do something meaningful and leave a legacy as some kind of evidence that we were here and that we mattered, or running away from it in terror, which kind of equates nicely with terror management theory, and drowning ourselves in addictions or other kinds of banal distractions and those kinds of things. This is such a human thing that we struggle with, and it's at the core of so many of our life challenges ultimately, that I tend to see this existential basis pretty much at the core of everything. And I find it very easy to have conversations with clients, even with children, about these things. I myself had my first existential crisis. That's a whole other story at age 6. So, and I think children have a way of talking about those things too. And I like to sort of debunk this idea that it's too abstract, too intellectual, too philosophical to be relatable, when in fact, I believe the times we're living in and through right now illustrate more poignantly than ever how it is a therapy approach made for right now. And what we are doing is we have been preparing for this for a long time. And this is it. I'm stepping up and I'm ready. And I feel like I am with the whole Saybrook family to do it.
Here, here, brother Spaeth. I love it. I think it's terrific. And I really appreciate how concise and incisive that statement was. I mean, it's grounded in a way that is both accessible and also really pulling from the tradition, the academic and the practitioner traditions that you raise. And I guess the other piece, maybe I'm biased, is that you have woven in children into this, because I think so often we say kids don't have existential crises. That's reserved for the 47-year-old guy who's going through a midlife crisis, or a woman who's struggling in her midlife. We're dealing with that throughout the entire lifespan in many respects. I really, really appreciate you bringing that to the fore. So vital. So you're teaching psychology, for the last 20 years now, right? I mean, Drake, you're coming up on 20 years. It's pretty awesome.
I know.
And you're teaching existential humanistic psychology at that. So for the record, for those of you who are listening, I have the pleasure of sitting amidst Rollo May's own personal library in our president's office here at Saybrook. And it's vast. There's so much there and so much to cover. These aren't simple topics to just dive into in a class where you can go in and jump out easily. How do you teach these very weighty concepts with your students, whether it's in a class or a series of classes? And particularly, what does an online course in these look like for existential humanistic work that you're doing?
Thank you. I sometimes will ruminate how to bring this sense of presence with a capital P that we like to bring to therapy and that I like to bring to an in-person classroom. I loved when I was concentrating heavily on brick and mortar in-person teaching, because the passion, everything that inspires me, my humor, such as it is right there fully online. And I have a captive audience, in real time for all of those things. I ruminate about how to bring that presence to the online forum as well. And there's no doubt that a Zoom live session can approximate that better than an asynchronous discussion forum or writing assignment. But even in those forums, what I try to do, just as I do in live Zoom sessions, is to self-disclose all over the place. I feel like what comes most easily to me is to share my organic excitement, because I feel like it isn't heady. It's more hearty, like HEARTY to me. It comes from that place in me. It comes from my gut, my heart, and my soul. And when I share my excitement about what it has meant for me in my life and how it's transformed my way of looking at myself, others, in the world, and the future, if I may borrow from Aaron Beck's cognitive triad, I think it becomes a little infectious. And I am fortunate at Saybrook to have students who are already excited and interested in it, but then they hear my excitement. And if I can somehow put it into the written form in my responses to them in the async forums, but I can really let loose in live sessions when we can schedule those. And it can be challenging to coordinate everybody's schedules to do those, more than occasionally. But even if I have only a few opportunities, I try to bring all of that fully online. I'm just really always keeping in mind Carl Rogers' statement of congruence being, I want my clients to see all the way through me. Well, I want my students to see all the way through me, that I don't want to hide behind a fake professional role. I mean, they're pretty much getting me who I am. And I'm not that terribly different in front of them as I am over dinner, chatting and sharing things with my wife, or, when I pet my dog, or, things like that. All of those pieces feel a lot more integrated for me than I think I've seen in some colleagues' cases or whatever. I try not to have them be separate compartments. I try to have it be a thread that really weaves through everything. So existential humanistic psychology is a way of life and being in the world and living for me that I'm sharing about in the classroom. So it feels like it just pours out and comes very easy.
So you really take the position, and I respect this. I'm not sure I could do the same thing, but I love how you're leaning into this. That there is not a, I call it the living room workshop analogy, right? So when I leave the workshop, I turn the light off, and then I'm at home. I occupy a different part of my life, but I love how you're also weighing into this as to live fully into your professional self and your personal self. It's all of you in that space or at home or petting the dog, whatever that may look like. Is that fair to say?
That's more than fair to say. And for me, it kind of resolves the conundrum we all face. How do I work in self-care in all of this? Because I have these conversations with students a lot. How do I manage my stress when it feels like it gets assigned to us, like one more thing that we're failing at making time for? And I guess, my big epiphany with all of that is, and I think of how the indigenous peoples really have a handle on this in so many great ways. If I'm not actively choosing the path I'm walking in the course of my day, moment to moment, through the weeks, months, and years of my life, if I'm not living according to what my soul, in the invitation of my soul to deliver my unique gifts to the world in the way that I feel called to do or see fit, if I'm failing to do that in some way, well, no wonder I'm feeling overly stressed or burned out. And I'm not saying this is for everybody. This is what works for me. I remind myself that this is what I have chosen to do, and I'm embracing it with joy, even as it's very stressful and challenging sometimes. But I don't have to worry about burnout if I'm embracing with joy the work that really feeds my soul. And if I'm really with authenticity delivering and answering the invitation to deliver my soul's gifts to the world that way.
That is fantastically put, sir. I love that. Yep.
And I stray from it, but I also manage to bring myself back. And when we go through these times, like right now, I'm a constant back and forth to Cincinnati because my mother's recently in hospice. And so it's really kind of exhausting and, trying to catch my breath moment to moment. But at least as I'm falling asleep, I'm still reaffirming those kinds of things. And then a moment as I wake up, I'm reaffirming those things and then leaping back into the fray, as it were.
There you go. And you're doing the best you can do, especially with those circumstances. So, given higher ed, I mean, we're all under the microscope. Institutions across the country and our faculty are especially under the microscope these days, especially where teaching is concerned. I think you're probably well aware of the national conversation about the value of a degree and the value of the classroom and the teacher that stands before us in the various online or in-person classrooms. I really wanted to focus or home in on this today with you because you have such strong respect from your students with respect to your teaching. I was reminded as I was reading a few of your outputs as of late, just and some of the things you mentioned, just how you bring your whole self into the classroom. What is it that you do? I love it. I mean, I think we're kind of brothers in this respect because when I taught, that student centeredness was so critical about making sure that the learning was front and center and that passion for the topic really kind of leaned into it. But you do something very special clearly that students respond to. You alluded to this. So I guess I'd like to hear more about your pedagogy and maybe any recommendations you have for faculty out there who are trying to figure it out.
I think something that it turns out I'm kind of good at, maybe, arguably, is if I'm listening to a student, which I try to do, or if I'm reading one of their discussion posts and kind of preparing to respond to it, I try to find something in what they're saying that feels familiar to me in some way. And I feel like I'm successful at this, maybe 95% of the time at least, where I can find something that feels familiar enough where I can kind of hone in on that thing in a way where I'm sort of saying to them in a meta kind of way, I see you with a capital S, I hear you with a capital H, I recognize what it is that you're struggling with, what it is that you're saying, and here's how I see it as connected to this course subject, or as connected to the existential humanistic perspective in some way. So it's like the first step is helping them be seen, validated, and registering their presence, and kind of honoring it by saying, here's how I'm receiving what it is that you're saying, and here's how I'm showing that I understand it. And here's how it shows that you're intuitively also understanding something that's really key to this course or this tradition.
That is kind of at the core what I think all great teachers do and should do. And I really appreciate, wasn't caught in a whole lot of pedagogical, I mean, not to belittle the work of pedagogists out there, but it wasn't caught in a lot of gobbledygook. It's really caught in that existential humanistic ethos, right? Like you're seeing, you're hearing these students, you're in presence with them. And one of the things that Dr. Theopia Jackson pointed out it's probably many months ago in a podcast, but also in our musings together, is that you're in journey with students as much as you're in journey with a client. So it's you're partners in this enterprise. It's not yes, you bring a series of background and knowledge and experience to the table, but you're also honoring who they are and what they bring to that equation. Is that fair to say?
Very fair. Yeah. And I see it, also in Martin Buber terms, I and thou. Buber makes the distinction between I, it versus I, thou. And in I, it relationships, we tend to objectify each other and relate to each other in very limited ways. And it's useful. It gets things done. It moves society along. And we have transactional relationships with each other. They're pretty benign, but we're not fully seeing each other and not relating to each other as equal whole human beings. So he talks about I, thou, and he uses that term thou to capture the sacredness and the mystery of that encounter. We're meeting the other on this level where the space becomes melty and fluid and fertile with potential. And, the mutual understanding that can be achieved in that connection feels mystical in some ways and expansive. It doesn't feel like our normal waking consciousness and kind of interaction that we have in that I, it kind of endless array of transactional things that we do with each other. So that's been the challenge for me, is in moving to solely online work. How do I preserve that I thou connection or have those I thou moments with students? And as I said, it's easier in live synchronous than it is asynchronous, but I still, even in asynchronous, strive to recognize something that's coming from, I guess for lack of a better description, their soul, and to make them feel reflected.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So well put. And I think that is a challenge with online learning, but it's also the opportunity. So often we get caught up in what can't be done right in the online sphere in terms of relationships. But Drake Spaeth is living proof it is done. And so many of our faculty they're living proof as well. So I want you to spend just a few minutes today talking to us about this incredible specialization that you coordinate, you lead for the university, and for those who are just tuning in to Saybrook and getting to know us. Saybrook University was founded as the Humanistic Psychology Institute back in 1971, and we changed our name in 1981 to the Saybrook Institute, and really reflective of our founding history back in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, but really clinging to that humanistic legacy. We've branched out, if you will. So we have a lot of programs out there, I think 30 master's and PhD programs across a wide array of disciplines. But psychology has always been our core focus. And the humanistic psychology program, the research psychology program, really emphasizes that humanistic lineage. So maybe Drake, if you could talk about what the specialization entails both at the master's and PhD level, the focuses, et cetera.
Well, and I'm very grateful to sort of have picked up the specialization from the extensive work that Lewis Hoffman did with the specialization. And I think for a while, Francis Kaklauskas, I can never say his name, did some great work with it as well. So here I am, and again, I'm always conscious that I'm in charge of the specialization that, as you say, is the container of the legacy of Saybrook, and I don't know how accurate it is to say, but it sometimes feels to me experientially like Saybrook bloomed as this marvelous thing from this legacy, and we're holding that seed that still is very productive and throwing off shoots, but so much of what Saybrook has become kind of came out of all of that. And gosh, I think of the CSIH specialization and how the College of Integrative Medicine and Health Sciences sort of blossomed from that in a similar way. And so it reminds me of sort of the sacredness of my duty as the legacy carrier. So yes, as you mentioned, we have an MA emphasis for 2 years where we give students kind of a grounded supportive understanding of those concepts. So for instance, they will have the foundations of existential humanistic psychology, and some of the first part of all of those courses, and then there'll be like a second part of some of those courses for the PhD program. So at the master's level, they'll learn enough to be dangerous. It'll be something that I think is for those who want to really enrich their engagement, like maybe they're artists or maybe they're teachers, maybe they work in a corporate kind of context, but they're hungry for a master's degree that feels like it has some depth that will allow them to engage relationally with people at a level that this sort of sets them apart from the way others engage. And it gives them kind of a sense of groundedness in challenging times, ultimately. And they have the value of that master's degree in terms of the higher learning aspects. But I find that those who take on the MA degree, they may not be seeking as much of the practical benefit of that as others might be in a business sense, but they really want that expanded relational quality and an understanding of the world, and maybe to enhance their own way of writing about the world or teaching about the world. In the PhD, we'll have both clinicians come into that who already have degrees at the master's level, maybe in marriage and family therapy or counseling or social work. We'll have those who have master's degrees from other disciplines, or people who come from various disciplines who want the psychology PhD not to become a clinical psychologist, but they might be doing a lot of clinical work at the master's level that they're already happy with. But this expansive immersion at the PhD level gives them a very deep immersion in the existential humanistic therapy approach. So they'll use that with their clients. If they're coming from other disciplines, I find that they're wanting to really get into teaching and research substantively in existential humanistic psychology traditions. And they feel that that might enhance some other teaching disciplines that they're doing, or they want to kind of immerse themselves in that work as well and to become researchers and teachers mostly.
What have you seen emerge from your students as of late, especially in the master's and PhD, that has really spoken to your heart, your mind, that you find compelling?
I have seen a lot of excitement that mirrors my own, that they feel like both the master's and PhD, they feel like they have a way of understanding and engaging with the world we're living in now and all of its chaos, and that they might emerge with something constructive and beautiful to offer this troubled world. That's what I'm seeing excitement about, especially because we've been doing a much better job than we've done historically in getting out of this celebration of individualism and self-expression for its own selfish sake, to a more expansive social justice oriented view of humanity that embodies what Sartre and Martin Luther King said when none are free until all are free. And Carl Rogers' understanding that at our best, we are pro-social beings working for the betterment of each other in the world. So in returning to those roots through this recent, more expansive embrace of social justice in the world, the students are finding everything that their heart is longing for in a healing psychological approach to the world. And I think a real strong reverent nod needs to be made to Dr. Fetterman and the transformative social change programs, because they've understood this now for some time, that that's such a critical extension of this. And so, working with them, just that organically makes sense as well. So getting a lot of interest in our programs from those students, like those students are taking electives in EHP that are fitting with what they're doing in that department, it just thrills me to no end, because that's what we need to do.
Yeah, well said, well said. Well, our time is coming to a close, Dr. Spaeth. And, with every single interview, I say this over and over again. I could spend hours talking to you, sitting in your presence and learning from you. But we're going to go into the last two questions. I'm changing my language because I think in the past I've used rapid fire, and given kind of the trauma collectively we've been going through, we're going to say quick take instead of rapid fire on this. So, what is your quick take in terms of what the term humanistic means to you? And I know it's a little redundant, but I think I'd like to hear Drake Spaeth's point on this.
I think whether it's attached to the word psychology or not, humanistic has to consider both our individual ways of being in the world as we move out of fragmentation into wholeness, following the sort of call of our own longing, as Carl Rogers kind of put it, that, we have this innate intuitive longing to be whole, and further to let that longing take us into how to heal the fragmentation in collective humanity, because we can't truly mend and heal our own individual fragmentation until we address that in some way. So humanistic means a genuine concern for each other, a genuine caring for each other. And I unapologetically say that it's synonymous with love. And that's what it ultimately comes down to.
Be unapologetic about that your whole life, Dr. Spaeth. That's well said.
Thank you.
So, with all that's out there right now, the challenges, the traumas in the world that we collectively and individually experience, I'd like you to offer our audience a few glimmers of insight, hope. What are three things people can do right now to improve, enhance their own mental health?
Well, I think if we have the ability to do it, all of us would benefit from reconnecting with the natural world and taking in beauty. Because I think if there ever was a definition of soul loss, it would be a removal of our ability to appreciate and understand and recognize beauty with a capital B. And the cultivation of beauty in all of the levels and in all of the ways that means would be the restoration of soul, or the recovery of soul. That being said, I'm still a fan of the old school ways of volunteerism, food pantries, community service. My wife volunteers at a domestic abuse women's shelter, and I feel that those things still are needed and have much value. I'm a fan of the old school ways of writing letters and emails to legislators and congresspeople, and all of the things that's most critical right now, as the future of our democracy may well be in jeopardy. And I think what mental health professionals really strongly need to address right now, Dr. Smirnova and I gave a presentation at a residential conference. The workshop title that I came up with was Conspiracy Theories, an unrequited existential longing for the transpersonal. So I think that we really, as mental health professionals, need to find creative ways of working with individuals who are trapped in these conspiracy networks and in the cult-like web, that kind of weave politics and religion together in twisted ways and have these distorted, awful kind of mirrors that perpetuate our inability to recognize truth for what it is. We have to untangle those webs and work with them at the soul transpersonal and depth level around these things and give them what their soul is really longing for.
I'm going to give you that fourth one because it's a great one, I think, especially with as salient as it is in these times. So I really appreciate your time, Drake. What a great opportunity to speak with you in depth again. Before you go, where can people find you on the web? Is there any particular book or website you want to direct people towards?
Interestingly enough, I don't have a particular website beyond my Facebook page, my LinkedIn page, and some of those typical kinds of things. I can be found the old-fashioned way through various email addresses and those kinds of things.
Good old-fashioned yellow pages, folks, and or the web, or the faculty directory on saybrook.edu.
Yes, very good.
Thank you for being here today, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed Dr. Spaeth as much as I did. Remember the three major takeaways that he provided, and I'll try and get these right. His first was, especially where it pertains to mental health, reconnect with the natural world. Take in the beauty that's around you. Number two, volunteer. Volunteer in your community. Find ways to give back and to be part of a larger community. And third, get active. Speak your mind. Write letters to your congresspersons, your governors, the folks that are decision makers. Being active in this way helps you feel as though you are being part of the solution. So 3 ways to help improve your mental health right now. If you want to see video elements, we've created these segments. Please visit our Saybrook YouTube page to view these. And if you'd like to support the podcast, go to Apple iTunes and leave a 5-star rating and review and subscribe so you can get episodes as they come out. If you're on Spotify, leave that 5-star rating and make sure to follow us. You can, of course, subscribe to us on most major podcast platforms, including Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Pandora, and again, my favorite, Pocket Casts. I think I should get some sort of additional revenue for that one. Saybrook students could benefit Pocket Casts for scholarships on that one. Remember to check our show notes for information on today's guests, including links to websites, books, etc. For more about our psychology program, including the existential humanistic specialization or our university, go to www.saybrook.edu. Click on Areas of Study at the top of the page and locate the psychology program to learn more. Or simply Google Saybrook University Psychology. That's all for today. Thank you so much. Take care and be well.